again this morning, Dr. John. We had, of course, questions came in last week and another one for this week in regards to sea level rise. And it's an interesting topic. It's a bit of a hot topic too because of what's going on out at the beaches literally as we speak. People talk about sea level rise and what's happening out there. Well, of course, it's really a storm surge plus large seas plus high tides altogether. Well, of course, that's a sea level rise, but that's one that only lasts a few days. We're sort of talking about sea level rise that lasts a long time, and you've done a bit of research, I believe.
Yes, I did, Mick, and of course I had to do a little bit because I mentioned last week in response to that question from our listener, is sea level rise real? Mm-hmm. And I gave my view last week that I didn't really find it convincing. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you do a bit of research, you can see that there is some documented evidence, and how much of that evidence is correct, I'm not really sure. Mm-hmm. But as you say, it hasn't really been suggested that sea level rise is what's causing what happened at Wombrel in the last week or two. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, we have seen similar erosion at Wombrel in the past, and probably even worse if you include what happened at Terrigal Haven back about 50 years ago or so, when the caravan park there was basically washed into the sea. So yes. The erosions and the storm surges that we see at Wombrel and Terrigal are not really new. They've been going on for quite a while.
Yep.
And I also mentioned, of course, that whenever the TV talks about sea level rise, you see these film clips of Pacific islands that have got water lapping up a bit higher than they used to be. But, of course, I also mentioned on another occasion that the Pacific floor is very volatile, and another possible cause of what we see in the Pacific is the land level dropping. Yep. Because islands do pop up and down in the Pacific, and the Pacific floor is pretty volatile. But you drew my attention last week, Mick, to the fact that Creation Ministries actually has a few articles on this on their website.
Yep.
And Creation Ministries actually does acknowledge that there is some level for some evidence for sea level rise. And apparently over the last century there has been a little bit of a rise. It's been mentioned in the last 100 years the sea level has risen about 18 centimetres, which is about 7 inches. And they weren't talking about climate change 100 years ago, so I'm not sure what that might have been due to at that time.
Yeah.
But it seems that it's generally accepted that over the last 50 years that maybe the sea level has risen about 10 centimetres, about 4 inches. Now, the official rate that's acknowledged in scientific circles in Australia is about 2 millimetres a year. So over 50 years, that's what you'd get. You'd get about 10 centimetres. But obviously the secular world at the present time would ascribe any apparent rise to climate change. And although that erosion at Wombrel is dreadful, it isn't new. But one of our very astute listeners, Helen, pointed out that if water levels are really rising throughout the world, then the first people to know would be the Dutch. Because there they live in Holland, which is known as the Netherlands. Not Neverlands, I'm not getting into the Netherlands. And that means low country. I mean, in French, Holland is Pays-Bas, which is low country.
Yeah, there's a lot of islands.
Sorry?
A lot of islands.
There are a lot of islands, and of course there's a lot of the mainland really there is below sea level. If you have a look at Holland, then a lot of it is below sea level. And they really should be the ones who would be observing rising sea levels more than anybody else. So I did a little bit of research on that. We might talk about Holland when we come back.
Absolutely. It's 8:15. You're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, and the question line, which you send your questions through to, it's a text line, is 0401 949 949. Creation Ministries International. If you have any questions, send them through to 0401 949 949. Now, we're talking this morning about sea level rise, and Dr. John's been speaking about the Dutch, who are, very famous shipbuilders, and they've got some amazing bridges, and there's lots of islands, and they've got a lot to do with the water, I believe, Dr. John. But what about sea level rise? Do they know a lot about it?
Yes, I believe they do, but they've been dealing with this problem for a long time, and they see that their land is sinking. And look, it's been going on for millennia, actually. I mean, even in Roman times in the Netherlands, they were, nearly 2,000 years ago, they were building dikes out of rubble and so on. And right through the centuries, they did that. And then they started to build them out of timber. And the Dutch were fantastic with the use of timber. I mean, they absolutely led the world with the use of timber. And I was there a couple of years ago and went and visited some of the windmills. Mm-hmm. And they had windmills converted into sawmills going back centuries. That's how they were able to lead the world in shipbuilding and exploring. People like William Dampier and Abel Tasman, who both came out this way, even before Captain Cook.
Yes.
So the Dutch were really, really onto timber usage. But then they had a disaster about 300 years ago because there was this little worm, a sea worm coming from a mollusk that got into the timber and ate it away, a bit like a sea termite. And that meant that they really had to change their ways a bit. It was catastrophic. But they then started to use more rubble and rock and that sort of thing. And the Dutch have learned to live with incoming water. They realise that they've got to do that because it's always going to happen. And they've done lots of wonderful things to deal with that incoming water, most of which is not actually from sea level rise and, the sea coming over the dikes. It's seepage. Mm-hmm. But what they've done is they've done a lot of land reclamation for farming, and they've built water courses, rowing courses, water playground type areas, things like that. And they recognise that they're going to have to live with that forever, but they believe that they're going to be able to deal with it no matter what happens. And I mentioned last week that, I believe that even if there is a little bit of small sea level rise, it's not going to be huge. Now, you mentioned something about the Arctic ice before.
Yes. Well, I guess when we come back, I might mention something I've learnt when I was down in the Snowies and something that I've learnt about the Arctic ice. And, interesting when it comes to sea level rise. It is 23 minutes past 8. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. From Creation Ministries International, we're talking a little bit this morning about sea level rise. And, Dr. John, you've possibly seen the Halley 6, I think it's called, Halley 6 research station down in the Antarctic. It's the British research station. Have you seen that one before?
No, I haven't.
No, it's an amazing machine, basically, and it really is a machine. It's a little town on sleds. They're like giant buildings, literally on sleds, and they have a big machine up front that can drag their entire town, which is a research station of a whole lot of buildings, all in like a big train almost across the ice sheets. And in the media, they've shown it numerous times in recent years where they've had to move it because the sea level ice is literally breaking away and they've had to move further and further inland. And we see this sea level ice and sometimes giant swathes of ice breaking off the Antarctic and then floating out to the ocean. And we see the media where they talk about this, giant island bigger than many countries, floating out into the ocean. But what they don't tell us is something that I learnt when I was working in management in ski resorts, and that is we always have to be aware of the ice that moves down the hill. Now, no one ever can see that ice moving down the hill, but the major danger is lift towers. They've got to be so careful how they protect the lift towers and dig around them as the ice very slowly marches down the hill, because of course there's more and more snow up top, which keeps pushing it down the hill. Same as in the Antarctic. I've seen a few graphs over the last 50 years of Antarctic ice, how over the last 50 years it's actually grown massively for about 46 years or something. And then there was like a big dive in around 2017, I think. It sort of had a big dive, but it's not the only dive it's had over 50 years. And yes, it's gone down below the average of the growth over the 50 years, but I don't know if there's a lot of difference come out of that. Yet people are, they're always screaming, showing these pictures of the ice floating out into the ocean and creating sea level rise, which doesn't seem to be happening so much.
Well, look, if a large chunk of ice breaks off, and like a big island, a massive island, maybe even the size of Tasmania or something like that, if that breaks off and floats out into the ocean, then once it's floating, then you can't get any more sea level rise because it's actually a big iceberg. Mm-hmm. And when an iceberg melts, then the water level does not rise at all. Mm. So once it's floating, then you can't get any more rise.
I understand that because ice is actually water, and as it freezes, it increases in volume. And then as it melts, it decreases in volume.
That's right. Ice is less dense than water, so as it melts, then it simply goes back to water, and the level does not rise at all. Mm. But look, I think we can be reassured that things are not going to be catastrophic, because the Bible tells us in Psalm 104 that God has set the boundaries of the seas, that they're not going to encroach on and overflow the earth anymore. Mm. Now, obviously, we do get catastrophes like tsunamis and things like that, and we've talked before on this program about coastline erosions and how some coastlines get badly eroded, like we're seeing here at Wombrel now. But, of course, others expand. And at Ephesus, for example, which was a port in the days of the Apostle Paul, it's now about 4 or 5 k's inland because it all got silted up. So these are the sort of things that we see. Coastlines change, but we are not going to see the whole earth inundated by water again, because the Bible tells us it won't happen.
That's great news. It is 8:30. We've got the news, weather and traffic coming up. We'll be back. Dr. John, the science news this week is that we can throw the textbooks out. They've got a new theory.
Yeah, well, that's right, Mick. And, tectonic plates are, as you say, an observation. We know that the Earth's crust is not an intact shell. It's broken up into these tectonic plates that shift around on the surface. And, of course, where two plates interact, there's sometimes a little bit of a gap. And so we've got the Pacific Rim of Fire, because what's underneath can come out.
And that's why quite often you actually see that's where the islands pop up. Out of nowhere, islands just appear.
That's exactly right. And, of course, you get the earthquakes, like in the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand a couple of years ago. Yep. I mean, New Zealand and Hawaii and PNG and the Philippines, there's lots of very, very active volcanoes in those areas. And it's because they're sitting on the line between two plates. Mm-hmm. And the earthquakes are caused by either those plates moving against each other, or one sliding underneath the other, or something like that. Yep. And earthquakes, of course, are pretty terrifying. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that that's also thought to be the cause of some of the mountain ranges like we have. I mean, we've got the Great Divide here in Australia, but that's not very active. But when you go over to the Andes in South America and the Rockies in North America, then you find that there's a lot of volcanic activity there. Mm. And, we know that there's the San Andreas Fault that lies around California, and there's a constant threat for earthquakes in San Francisco and Los Angeles and other major cities. But I suppose the question is, how did our Earth's crust get to be fractured the way it is now?
Yeah.
I mean, we observe that we do have these tectonic plates, and somehow or other maybe a fracture occurred. And this article that you're talking about was suggesting how that cracking might have happened. And they thought that maybe and this is apparently an old theory that they've now resurrected, that the Earth's core heated up a little bit more and expanded, and then cracked the surface,
Yep.
so that we got these tectonic plates. But the world doesn't have really an answer as to why. I mean, that's speculation that that things heated up and expanded. But of course, when we look at the Bible, we find that there may well be an explanation for what happened.
Yeah.
Because when we look at what happened at the time of Noah's flood, the Bible tells us that when Noah and his family and all the animals went into the ark and God shut the door after them, then it tells us that the windows of heaven were opened and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But it also says that all the fountains of the deep were broken up.
Mm-hmm.
So, from a biblical point of view, that's when the tectonic plates started. Right? Now, what caused that? The Bible doesn't tell us, but an event certainly happened. Now, whether it cracked from the outside or the inside, we don't really know. But it looks to me as though that's really when it happened, at the time of the flood. And it's very interesting, of course, that that water that would have come out, the subterranean water, would have been quite warm.
Mm.
And there's another thing that we think may have been caused by the flood, as well as the tectonic plates and the fracturing of the Earth's crust, and that's the Ice Age. Now, we've been talking about ice. We started out talking about that this morning. But when we come back, we might have a little bit of a chat about the Ice Age.
Okay, this sounds good. It is 17 minutes to 9. You're on 94.9. If you have any questions, send them. Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. He talks to us about all sorts of sciencey things, creation, evolution, and you send your questions through to our text line 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, we've had a couple of questions come in. One, tell us a bit about Gondwana, and the other one is, I'm aware there's only about 30% of the planet is land. If the land was levelled, how much water would be over it? Thanks. And I'm assuming they mean levelled and all the water on top. I know that a story that was in the Washington Post a few years ago, they were talking about, I think that the headline was, "Study deep beneath the earth, more water than all the oceans combined." So there's a lot of water out there, and at least now the scientists know that there's water down there. And when the Bible talks about the water coming up from the deeps, well, we know it really was there now, because the scientists have found the stuff that they spoke about thousands of years ago.
Well, look, that's going to give us a bit more to talk about next week, about the amount of water that really is in the earth, and also that question on Gondwana. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that we started out today talking about water and sea level rises and so on, and we're going to now mention a little bit about ice ages, and that's got a bearing on the question about Gondwana as well. Mm-hmm. So whoever sent that question in about Gondwana, listen to what we're going to say about the ice ages, because it'll have a bearing on what we talk about next week. But look, the ice ages are probably related to Noah's flood as well. Now, the secular world knows that there was an ice age. In fact, they believe that there were several. But there really is, there's definite evidence for an ice age. Whether there's evidence for more than one is arguable. But look, we know that there was, because we see the existence of what they call moraines, which are great collections of rock and rubble that you might see at the end of a glacier or at the side of a glacier. And these moraines have been pushed into place by ice. Now, we know that because liquid water can't do it. It has to be ice that pushes these lots of rubble into place. And, of course, we also know that a lot of the Earth's surface, or some of it anyway, the bedrock has got great gouges and scratches in it that really can only have come from ice, not liquid water.
Yes.
And, of course, that bedrock happens to be sedimentary rock.
Yeah.
Now, that sedimentary rock came from Noah's flood.
Yeah.
So the ice ages are intimately associated with Noah's flood.
I find it really interesting that just before, for the first time, I'd never really considered it. You said those waters would have come up from the depths and they would have been hot. Now, I remember at school learning about the Mpemba effect, I think it's called, M-P-E-M-B-A. I don't know how to pronounce that, but the Mpemba effect, where hot water actually freezes faster than cold water, and it's got something to do with evaporation, the way that the water is evaporating and causing this freezing effect. That only makes sense, that after the flood, if all these hot waters came up from tectonic plate areas, that there would have been that Mpemba effect, and an ice age would have possibly come very close after.
Yeah, well, look, there's no doubt that the waters of Noah's flood must have been pretty warm, because a lot of them came from underneath the earth. I mean, if you've been to Rotorua in New Zealand, you've got great big lakes there at Rotorua that are hot.
Yeah. I've been to the Rockies in North America, where we're actually sat inside the giant pools that are heated in the middle of winter while it's snowing on us, and it was warm as toast because, of course, they're being heated from way down in the earth.
Like sitting in a spa in a snowstorm. But yeah, look, that subterranean water is hot. Now, what we believe, and the secular world hasn't really got an appropriate explanation for the Ice Age. They really don't know how. They can't devise anything, any model that suggests how the Ice Age would actually have formed. But one of our creation scientists has come up with an idea that really does make a lot of sense. And it relates to the fact that we've got this warm water as the flood waters, and of course that would have evaporated much more readily. Now, to get an ice age, you've got to have heaps of snowfall, and that snow can't melt. It's got to accumulate.
Yep.
Now, when you put all of the factors together, you get the hot water evaporating. As you mentioned, it will then cool because of the latent heat of vaporisation that takes heat out as well. But that evaporation would cause massive amounts of snowfall.
Yeah.
And, of course, snowfall melts because of the effect of sunlight mainly. But because of all the volcanic activity, and everybody concedes that there was a lot of volcanic activity during the flood. The secular world doesn't believe in the global flood anyway, but they do believe in a lot of volcanic activity. Now, volcanic activity is known to throw up a lot of particulate matter. And even now, when we get a major volcanic eruption, it does cool the Earth to quite an extent, because all the particulate matter in the atmosphere reflects a lot of the sunlight.
Yeah.
So here we've got a combination of lots of evaporation, lots of snowfall, and lots of that snow not melting because of the sunlight. So we've got the perfect conditions now for an ice age.
Yeah.
And it really is quite interesting that when you have a look at what the Bible actually says, the events that it describes, you can then relate that to the scientific observations that we have.
Yep.
And it's generally believed in creationist circles anyway that ice age probably occurred some decades or maybe a century or so after the flood, but lasted for about 600 or 700 years before it then started to come back to the normality, I suppose you'd call it, that we have now.
Yeah, interesting how you talk about the evaporation. I know working in ski resorts, it was always important, when we were making snow at above zero temperatures. A lot of people go, how can you do that? Well, they used to blast a lot of air through the snow guns. That's to cause evaporation, because evaporation causes cooling. And, of course, then you get snow. Even at, up to, in theory, up to plus 6 degrees, they can still make snow as long as the humidity is low enough. And, of course, once the rain would have stopped then and the evaporation started, I can see how that cooling effect would actually come into play. It's amazing.
It is amazing, isn't it, Mick? And look, I think the lesson that we really need to take away from all of this is that the Bible is absolutely true. I mean, it's the book that really does talk about the true history of the world. Now, science talks about the history of the world too, but it's all speculative history. It's what might have happened or what they believe did happen. But when you look at what the Bible says what really did happen.
Yeah.
And when we examine all of the scientific evidence, we find that it accords with what the Bible has always said. And remember, our Bible was written 3,500 years ago, those books of Moses, which give us that early history of the world. And the good news really is that because we can be confident, and the scientific evidence is compelling, because we can be confident that the Bible is true in the history, we know that it's true in what it says about Jesus.
Absolutely. Wow, that was awesome. Thank you, Dr. John. It's funny, when you piece all the little jigsaw piece puzzles back together, how it just fits together so well. The Bible, written so long ago. And it's so accurate. Thank you again, Dr. John. What an awesome week.
Yeah, and we're going to have another one